Genetics is my favorite unit. Why do you look the way that you do? And how come you look a lot like your grandma, but you don't hardly look like your parents at all? So we get to study how we get to pass on these genes. Remember, your genes are in your DNA, which is in your nucleus. So now we know how the DNA codes for proteins, how we can build those proteins, because your proteins are what make you, you. We know how we can do this using the energy from the cell, that photosynthesis makes glucose, and then your body uses glucose to make ATP. And ATP is fueling the process of building your cells and reading the DNA and building the proteins. And now we know how we made egg and sperm so that your genes could come together to create the first little zygote cell that was you. And then we learned how to do mitosis, which made you go from one single cell to hundreds of trillions of cells. And we have already learned about the process of differentiation, how your cells became different from one another to create your different tissues and organ systems. Okay? So let's study this process of genetics. Let's see how these different genes from the egg and the sperm work to come together to create the way that you look. We need to start by studying some vocabulary terms that we're going to use all throughout this unit. Our first one is inheritance or heredity. So this is what are you inheriting from your parents. Okay, so this is just the genetic transmission of genes which make your characteristics. Okay, so getting passed from parents to offspring. So genes code for your traits. And a trait is anything. It could be how you digest dairy products, your hair color, or if it's straight or curly, your eye color, your skin color. All of these things that we can describe, that we can see, and that we can measure are your traits. And they are coded for in your DNA, in your genes. Okay, we've had this one already, a homologous chromosome. Remember that you have two pairs of each gene, or two copies of each gene, one from mom, one from dad. And so you have homologous chromosomes because you got one set of chromosomes from mom, you got one set of chromosomes from dad, and they both contain genes for everything. So on one of your chromosomes from mom, you have a gene for eye color. Well, on the homologous chromosome from your dad, it also has a gene for eye color. Okay, so they can pair up. And we've seen one of these pictures before. This is a karyotype, which is a picture of someone's chromosomes when they're the most condensed. Remember that numbers 1 through 22 are your autosomes, and your very last pair, number 23, are your sex chromosomes. This determines whether you are male or female characteristics. Okay. So remember, your autosomes code for everything about you except for your secondary sexual characteristics, 1 through 22. Okay. So here are some new genetic words. Okay. Genotype. When I ask for a genotype, what I'm asking for is what copies of the genes did you get? Okay, so what copies did you get? So for example, for eye color, did you get a brown-eyed gene and a blue-eyed gene? Or did you get two brown-eyed genes or two blue-eyed genes? What versions of the gene did you get? Okay, that is your genotype, your actual genes. Genotypes are always going to be represented by two letters. Okay, one letter from mom, one letter from dad. Okay, so whenever I'm asking for a genotype, I'm asking for two letters. On the flip side, I could ask you for a phenotype. A phenotype is a physical description, okay? pH and pH. Phenotype is a physical description. So your phenotype is what do you actually look like? How do those genes work together to create you, to create your trait, okay? So when I'm asking for a phenotype, I'm asking for a physical description. Oh, they have blue eyes. Oh, they have straight hair. That fruit has stripes on it. Okay? It's a physical description. Make sure you know the difference between a genotype and a phenotype. Those two words are really important, and I'm going to be asking you for these two on your worksheets tons and tons and tons, okay? So to do your best, know the difference between a genotype and a phenotype. So keeping things simple, okay, we're going to start off with simple genetics. When you have different versions of the gene in you, like a blue-eyed gene and a brown-eyed gene in the same person, one from mom, one from dad, one of those genes is going to be called dominant, and one of those genes is going to be recessive, okay? If a gene is dominant, we are going to use a capital letter to represent it in the genotype, okay? The dominant letter also tells you, or the dominant gene also lets you know which letter to use, because you use the first letter of the dominant word. Now, if it's dominant, that means it's stronger than the other version of the gene. So it covers up and it hides the other one. So if you have one dominant gene, you look like the dominant phenotype. Okay, and I'm going to do some examples to help you out. On the other side, you have your recessive version of the gene. The recessive gets the same letter as the dominant, but in lowercase. So when we're representing the genotype, the recessive gets the lowercase letter. The recessive is weaker than the dominant, so it gets covered up. It gets hidden. If you have a dominant and a recessive, you can't see the recessive because it's weak and it gets hidden. Now, there are three possible genotypes because you can get two dominant genes, so you'll have two capital letters, or you can get one of each gene, one dominant and one recessive, so one capital, one lowercase, or you can get two recessive genes or two lowercase genes, two lowercase letters, okay? Now, because biologists love vocabulary words and love calling things by other words, each one of these combinations has its very own vocabulary term. Yes, you need to know these. It is very important. Okay, so if you have two letters the same, you are called homozygous because homo means the same and zygous is referring to that first individual zygote cell. Okay, so homozygous means the same. So there's two ways that you can be homozygous. You can have two dominant genes, so you're homozygous dominant, or you can have two recessive genes and be homozygous recessive, okay? But if you have two of the same letters, you are homozygous. And since there's two ways to be homozygous, you have to specify which type of homozygous are we talking about. If you just write homozygous, you're only half right, okay? Now, let's throw in another vocabulary word, purebred. Purebred means homozygous. They mean the exact same thing. So you can be homozygous dominant, or you can be purebred dominant. It means the same thing. It means you have two capital letters. You can be homozygous recessive, or purebred recessive, means the exact same thing. You have two lowercase letters. Now, if you have one of each, a dominant gene and a recessive gene, a capital letter and a lowercase letter, then you are heterozygous, because hetero means different, and your two genes are different. You have two different copies of the gene, so heterozygous. Another word that you can replace with heterozygous is hybrid, because a hybrid means a mix of two things. So like a hybrid car is gas and electric. A hybrid genotype means one dominant and one recessive. Okay? Make sure that you can correctly use these terms: heterozygous, homozygous, dominant, recessive, purebred, and hybrid. It is really important that you use these words correctly. Now, we're going to be studying simple genetics. We're going to start out very simple, where one is dominant, one is recessive. But you need to understand that in humans, most human genes are way more complicated than that, because we have something called polygenic inheritance. Poly meaning many. And what that means is we don't have just one gene that controls a trait. It's actually controlled by two or more genes working together to create the outcome, okay? The most complicated one that we're going to study specifically in this class is your blood group, whether you're A, B, AB, O, positive, negative. That's going to be the most complicated one we're going to study by looking at the specific genes. But your eye color and your skin color, stuff like that, that has lots and lots of different options, not just two different versions, but lots and lots and lots of variation. It's polygenic because it depends on what you get on lots of different genes and how they work together, okay? Now, another word that we're going to see is the word alleles. You can use alleles and gene pretty interchangeably in biology, okay? So, because I say you have a brown-eyed gene and a blue-eyed gene, but you could say you have a brown-eyed allele and a blue-eyed allele. So these are the different forms of the same gene. I personally just don't like the word allele. I think it's really hard to say because my tongue doesn't like to move right. So I'll say blue-eyed gene, brown-eyed gene. But just know if you see the word allele, that's what it means. It means a different version. Okay? Now, your genes are located in your chromosomes, and we know the locations of some genes, and we call its location a loci. Okay? So check it out. Here's a chromosome from someone's mom and a chromosome from dad. Okay? We've labeled 5 genes here, A, B, C, D, and E. And notice how they have some that are the same and some that are different. So here they have a big A and a big A. So they're homozygous dominant. At B, they have a big B and a little b. So they're heterozygous. At D, they have little d. So they're homozygous recessive. Okay? So each one represents a different gene, and they have different alleles for those genes. So let's look at some examples of how dominant and recessive can work. Remember, dominant is the strong one that covers up and hides the recessive, and you always look like the dominant if you have one single dominant gene or allele, and recessive is the one that is hidden or weaker. So for example, in Angus cattle, they can have black fur or red fur. Black fur is dominant, okay? How would you know that it's dominant? Well, sometimes the question will just tell you black is dominant. Some will give you the different genotype options, and you can tell by looking at it which one's dominant. We'll get some practice with that soon in the next couple of days, okay? But I'm telling you, black is dominant. So we're going to use the letter B for black, okay? So a capital B means a black allele, and a lowercase b is going to be for the red allele, okay? Because we use the same letter, but red gets the recessive, which is a little b. So this cow is black. Since they are black, there are two options for their genotype. They could be big B, meaning they have two black genes, or they could be big B, little b. That means they have a black gene and a red gene. But since black is dominant, it hides the red, so you can't see it. So they look black. This cow has red fur. That means it is homozygous recessive. It has to be little b, because it cannot have a black gene, because if it had a black gene, it would be black. But since it doesn't have a black gene, it looks red. In Hereford cows, having a white face is dominant. What letter should we use to represent a white face? Hopefully you said W. Since white is dominant, we should use a W to represent the dominant allele. Not having a white face is recessive, so it'll get a little w. This cow has a white face, so it has a dominant gene. So its genotype could be WW, two white face genes, or big W, little w, for one white face gene and one not white face gene. This cow does not have a white face. That means it does not have a white face gene, so little w, little w.